Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this AMPO webinar, this first webinar of 2025. Hope everyone is doing well and dealing with all the stuff that's going on. My name is Ellen Zaviska. I serve as AMPO's Transportation Planning Manager. And this is our webinar brought to you by our Environment and Resiliency interest group. I'm still just letting a few folks in from the waiting room. But again, just very grateful to have all of you with us and looking forward to hearing from our speakers and having a great conversation. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Ask you to keep your mic muted during the speakers. You are welcome to submit comments or questions at any point in the chat box. We do record the meetings, and we also use a transcript that we take just to put together notes. We don't share anyone's identity who is attending, but we will share notes and slides within a couple weeks after this event. And I'll ask folks to add your organization handle to your Zoom name so that we know where you're joining us from. And ask, we know, just acknowledge there's a lot of stuff going on in the transportation world right now, a lot of, uncertainty. This webinar isn't focused on that. I'll ask you to, keep our focus for our conversation on the speakers and the topics they're here to speak about. But just to acknowledge that, there's a lot going on. If you're not getting regular email updates from AMPO about policy updates and lawsuits and all that interesting stuff that's going on, please put your email address in the chat if you want to get those email updates, because we're sending them pretty much as quickly and furiously as we can, trying to keep everyone updated. And we're hearing, we try not to overload you, but we're hearing good feedback from those updates. So if you want to get those policy updates and you're not, please drop your email into the chat and I will get that to our communications person. And with that, we will move on to quickly introduce today's moderator. Catherine is with MWCOG in Washington, D.C., where she is the Transportation Resilience Planner there. Person in the waiting room. You can see her very impressive biography here on the slide, but she's been working with the different areas of resiliency for a long time, especially the PROTECT program planning associated with that. She has degrees from Johns Hopkins and Scripps Institution of Oceanography. She's worked with the Climate Reality Project, and prior to joining MWCOG was with Hampton Roads. And with that, I will ask Catherine to introduce our topic and our speakers.
Thank you, Ellen. So as we were planning for this webinar today, we really were starting to think about how there are so many tools that are out there that can help transportation planners really advance the resiliency of our transportation assets and systems in the face of worsening natural hazards and extreme weather. There are all sorts of resources, reports, and frameworks. And then there are also some more data-heavy tools like the ones that we're going to be talking about today. They can really help planners identify the potential risks and vulnerabilities, and in turn, how they can best help prioritize potential solutions once those are identified also. So today we're going to be learning about two such tools. The first is the Resilience and Disaster Recovery tool, or the RDR tool, which will be presented to us by a pilot user at the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. This is the MPO for the Norfolk, Newport News, and Virginia Beach region in southeastern Virginia. And then we're going to pivot to discussing the Vulnerability Assessment Scoring tool, also known as VAST, where we will hear from someone who helped develop the tool, as well as someone from the Indianapolis MPO who has used that tool extensively to help develop their regional resiliency snapshot. Next slide. I'm just going to quickly introduce our presenters for today. So first, we'll be hearing from Dale Stith at Hampton Roads TPO. I know Dale very well I used to work in Hampton Roads at the PDC, so I'm glad to welcome Dale to this webinar today. She's been there for a long time, contributing to transportation solutions since 2006. She's the lead of the Long Range Transportation Plan, or the LRTP, there, and she holds a master's in transportation and urban systems from North Dakota State and a bachelor's from ODU, which is down there in Hampton Roads as well. Next, we will be hearing from Cassie Bott, who is a director of climate resilience at ICF, which is a consulting firm. She's been there for an impressive 15 years, working closely with local governments and other transportation agencies at all scales to do climate impacts. Whenever folks say climate at ICF, I always hear Cassie Bott. And she's worked with a lot of the other COGs and MPOs in the area, and she also helped develop the Federal Highways FAST, which we will hear about from her today. And then last, we will be hearing from Annie Dixon at the Indianapolis MPO. Annie is a graduate of DePauw University, specializing in equitably improving sustainability in public transit. She served as mobility manager for CERTA before joining Indianapolis, where she worked on leading organizational and strategic planning and managing operations for transit service. And Annie has just been a real shining light for me. Someone introduced her to me as I started my career here at COG. And it's just been really great working with Annie, sort of hearing what they're doing in Indianapolis with regards to transportation resilience planning, and just sort of sharing different ideas. So I really am thankful for Annie for joining us today. And first I'm gonna do a poll. Ellen, as you all know, you get AICP credit for being a part of this webinar, and as such, we have to do polling questions. So over the course of today's webinar, we will do 3 polling questions. And so I just launched the first poll, just kind of level setting. Is your agency focusing on resilience as part of your transportation planning? Yes, it's a major focus. Yes, it's a minor consideration. No, but we're thinking about it. Not really of interest, or any others, if you can share in the Zoom chat. So as the responses are coming in, the large majority of folks are saying yes. We're split between yes, it's a minor consideration, and yes, it's a major focus. A couple of people have said no, but we are planning to. And no one has yet selected no, it's not of interest. So I think people have self-selected joining this webinar. I'm going to end the poll so that we can get straight to our presenters. And I think I can quickly share the results. So most folks either said yes, it's a major focus, or yes, it's a minor consideration. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this poll, and then we are going to head over to Dale. So I think, Dale, if you want to take it away, you can share your slides, and we can go from there.
Oh, too many buttons on Zoom. So hopefully you all can see my slides.
Yep, I can see them.
Perfect. All right. Thanks for that introduction. I'm glad to have the opportunity to be here today to present the Resilience and Disaster Recovery, or RDR tool. This tool was developed by the very talented team over at Volpe, but unfortunately they could not be here to present on the tool today. So I'll be providing a broad overview of what the tool does and how we've used it here at the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization, specifically in our long-range transportation plan to improve resilience in project prioritization and in decision-making. So as we all know, transportation networks are under constant threat from hazard-related disruptions, whether it's hurricanes or flooding, wildfires, or other extreme events. These disruptions impact mobility, economies, and daily life. And resilience investments are key to reducing these impacts. They minimize travel disruptions and ensure that people and goods can move efficiently even during hazard events. But we need to ask, which infrastructure investments provide the greatest reduction in impact under a range of possible hazard conditions? And how are these benefits being distributed? Are we making investments that help all users, or are some communities being left behind? So this is where the RDR tool helps. It allows agencies to explore different scenarios, analyze the benefits of resilience investments, and support data-driven decision-making. So on this slide, we show estimating return on investment, or ROI. And traditionally, when we do this, we look at initial costs, system performance over time, and repair costs. But this really doesn't fully capture the long-term benefits of resilience investments. So if we focus on this graphic, we all know resilience investments require a lot of upfront costs, which can make our decision makers hesitant. And so if resilience investments are made early on, what we see is that during hazard events, these investments reduce costs and service disruptions compared to when we don't do these investments up front. And so, obviously the net benefits are the difference between having these resilience investments early on. But really, the biggest benefits come in the recovery phase. So if the resilience investments are done again up front, it leads to reduced downtime and fewer economic costs as compared to not investing properly in resilience. So the payoff is not only more reliable performance during the hazard event, but also lower repair and cost time. But there's lots of challenges in developing or doing a resilience investment analysis. And so I list some of them here on this slide. The future is unknown, right? There's lots of uncertainty. There's lots of unpredictability. And it's hard to plan for the future, especially long-term futures. There is a range of resilience investments available. How do we determine which ones will be the most effective? And if we want to be thorough, this means analyzing and testing thousands of scenarios. This is something that's overwhelming, especially if you don't have the right tools. And existing travel demand models aren't really geared to do this well or quickly and analyze lots of scenarios and lots of different future hazards. So this is where the RDR tool comes in. This tool is designed to tackle these challenges by modeling multiple future scenarios, assessing a return on investment for resilience projects, and providing insights into network disruptions. It can be used for project prioritization and even equity impacts. And so the next few slides will kind of dig into an overview of the RDR tool. Now remember, I'm not with the Volpe team, so I know enough to be dangerous here, but I will provide this overview. So the RDR tool is a screening level analysis tool, providing that high level insight into resilience investments. One important note is it is hazard agnostic. So here in Hampton Roads, we're looking at flooding vulnerability, but it can be used for wildfires, earthquakes, rockfall. It can be whatever hazard is equated to your region. It is designed to leverage agency or even public data and existing tools, making it easy to integrate into the planning process. And it also aligns with the US DOT benefit cost analysis guidance, which is very helpful for agencies as they're applying for resilience-related grants. And I'd like to note that the tool is free. It's available to the public, and there is a link to the download, which will also be at the end of this presentation. So in terms of data requirements for the tool, it really is only 4 main inputs. You have your network data, trip data, where are people coming from, where are they going, your hazard scenarios, and that would be at the link level, and then project investment details in terms of the resilience investments being considered. And my understanding is recent upgrades have even made that some of this data can be open source, like for the network data, making it even easier to use for stakeholders. And this slide will show that scenario space and how it expands as one works through the RDR tool suite. So really the RDR meta model is the heart of the tool. It is structured around 2 key components. You have external factors. These are your uncertainties like population growth, land use changes, disruptive events, and then different levers, which would be your resilience investments. You have core models that feed into the RDR meta model. This starts with a traditional travel demand model, which would establish baseline conditions. And then this information is fed into Equilibre, which is an open source model that can simulate thousands of different network scenarios. This information is fed into that RDR meta model, which expands the scenario space and assesses hazard impacts and resilience project performance across that range of hazard conditions. And it looks at different recovery times and even recovery horizons. And then finally, all this information produces it monetizes performance and damage repair. So the RDR, return on investment analysis tool, basically ranks these investments to help inform decision making. The tool provides economic evaluation different ways so that users can select the best method for their needs. You have the traditional BCA that looks at total net benefits over a selected analysis period. There's also a BCA under uncertainty, or they refer to the regret analysis. Here at the TPO, we found this regret ranking particularly useful because it helps us evaluate the cost of inaction versus taking proactive measures. And then there's also the break-even analysis, which looks at total benefits over a period of time without factoring in costs. So then that helps identify where is that break-even point of how much resilience project costs can be afforded with the associated benefits. So given that the RDR tool suite is used when there are lots and lots of scenarios that you're analyzing, reviewing and understanding the outputs can be very challenging in text form. So the tool is set up to provide information through very visual Tableau dashboards. This slide shows some of those examples. These dashboards are tailored for different audiences, so some are very technical to further analyze information from the tool, and some are very high level and exploratory that can be used to communicate to policymakers and the public. And then to kind of summarize, one easy way to think about what the RDR tool does is thinking about it in three main components. First, you have the exposure analysis tool that identifies those vulnerable assets under that given hazard event, and outputs from this component would include your link level, exposure, and disruption. Then you have the ROI analysis tool, which identifies which projects provide the most benefit across that range of future hazard scenarios. This is where you'd have that ROI ranking, even that regret ranking. And then this is one of the newer features. We're excited about exploring this a little bit more, but the benefits analysis tool highlights how different users may experience benefits of resilience projects. This would be especially useful if you're applying an equity lens to your resiliency analysis. So now shifting gears to how we've been using this tool here at the HRTPO. With us at the HRTPO, resilience isn't an afterthought. It's really embedded into our project prioritization process. We incorporate resilience measures to ensure that our decision-making is proactive, data-driven, and better prepared for future uncertainties. And then so very quickly, for those who might not be familiar with the Hampton Roads area, we are located in southeastern Virginia at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. We're home to 1.7 million people. And due to our strategic location, we are a critical transportation hub for supporting freight movement. The Port of Virginia is located here, and also military operations. We have numerous military facilities, including the largest naval base in the world. And of course, we're a great tourist destination. So because of all these factors, ensuring that our infrastructure remains resilient is not just important for our regional economy, but also for the state and for national security. So we are experiencing the fastest rate of relative sea level rise here on the East Coast. And some areas here in our region are forecasted to experience either permanent inundation, others are experiencing more frequent flooding, and then we have some areas of the region that are experiencing flooding and they never did before. So this is why we have recognized that we must plan early and we must plan often in our various processes. We have seen firsthand what happens when resilience is not prioritized. Back in 2003, with Hurricane Isabel, one of our regional tunnels flooded and it cut off a major corridor. This corridor is heavily used for freight and military movements, as well as just regular residents across the region. It was shut for more than 30 days, resulting in significant rerouting and congestion across the region. And it's not just flooding. We have another event, which we lovingly refer to as Carmageddon, when nearly every one of our major water crossings in the region closed for various reasons. And it brought our whole region to a complete standstill for more than 24 hours. So these disruptions exposed some of our transportation vulnerabilities and again underscores why we need a resilient transportation system. So our sister agency at the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, which is where I met Catherine, they've been leading resilience planning efforts for over a decade, and Ben McFarland is at the forefront of that. In addition to multiple coastal resiliency and climate change efforts, they've worked on several joint land use studies with the military, and they've created a resilience projects dashboard to monitor implementation of resilience projects. These efforts have led to the adoption of a regional sea level rise policy, which we actually factor into our long-range transportation planning process. And then at the HRTPO, we've also conducted multiple transportation-focused resilience studies, and these efforts have been led by Sam Belfield. These studies have helped increase awareness. They've actually influenced project design on a number of our projects where designers have gone back and said, we need to elevate this facility to make sure it's more resilient. And the most importantly, it introduced resilience metrics into our project prioritization tool, which we did not have previous to these studies. So when we introduced resilience metrics into our project prioritization tool, we quickly realized that having a general consideration was not enough. We wanted a way to quantify resilience objectively so that we could allocate more meaningful points in our prioritization process. And the RDR tool provided this for us. It provided us an opportunity to analyze flooding impacts, disruption costs, and the benefits of mitigating measures in a very structured and data-driven way that could feed into our prioritization process. So very high level in our long-range transportation planning process, we do not try to predict the future. We instead try to prepare for uncertainty because as you all probably do, you recognize over a 20-year horizon, there are so many countless factors that influence how our region can grow and how that may impact transportation. So we use exploratory scenario planning where we develop multiple plausible futures to test how transportation projects can hold up across different conditions. We're currently working on our 2050 LRTP, and I have some of those scenarios here on the screen. Previously, when we've done scenario planning, we could not look at different sea level rise scenarios as a part of this effort, but with the RDR tool, we're now able to say as a part of not only looking at how growth might occur differently across the region, but we can look at different sea level rise and storm surge events. In fact, one of our scenarios, that greater inland westward growth, is actually looking at the results of people moving more inland to avoid the coastal flooding vulnerability issues. And then so for our project prioritization, we have a very multi-layered data-driven approach to analyze candidate projects for our long-range transportation plan. It's very comprehensive. I could talk about our prioritization process probably for an hour alone, but just very high level. We analyze our candidate projects across all of our scenarios so that we can identify the most resilient and effective transportation investments. We do this by project category because how we analyze a tunnel is very different than how we might analyze a bike lane. And we have about 70 measures in our prioritization tool. And we have different, like a land use model, a travel demand model, and an economic model that provides us this data-driven measures to look at a project's utility, economic vitality, and project viability. And again, what the RDR tool does is it gives us this comprehensive tool to give us those resilience measures that feed directly into our prioritization process. So in terms of our objectives with the RDR tool, all of our objectives with having a comprehensive data-driven process were met. We're able to model uncertainty across different hazard scenarios. We're able to measure disruption impacts, specifically quantifying congestion as a result of flooding, and also quantifying congestion avoided from mitigating flooding, and then assessing resilience investments to make sure that we have the most effective mitigation strategies. And we don't just use the RDR tool in one spot during the development of our long-range transportation plan. We use it throughout the process. So I've already talked about the scenario planning itself with our scenario narratives, but we also use the tool to help identify candidate projects up front to make sure critical and vulnerable facilities are being part of the conversation. We use it, again, to prioritize our investments We're currently working with our stakeholders to enhance those resiliency considerations, to factor in more of the robust outputs that come out of RDR, and also weave in that equity component. And then we also use it for fiscal constraint to make sure that those most critical and most vulnerable projects are being highly considered when we're saying what can we actually afford over a 20-year timeframe. And so the RDR tool isn't just being used by us here at the HRTPO and HRPDC. Hillsborough TPO also was a testing partner with Volpe, as well as Houston Galveston Area Commission. And this tool really isn't just for NPOs, it's also for state DOTs, for academia, and also transportation consultants. And one of the biggest benefits that I can actually speak to firsthand is that the Volpe team is terrific with ongoing support. As we've had new staff come on board, the Volpe team has been incredibly helpful with making sure that everyone understands the data inputs, the tool functionality, troubleshooting, and interpreting results. New versions are released biannually, and some of these new features that they include come from user suggestions. So this is just a slide on how to access the tool. Again, it's free, open source. It's available for download at GitHub. And in addition to the tool itself, there's also comprehensive documentation and training videos to help users get started. And so that essentially wraps up the overview of the RDR tool and a role and how to use it in the long-range transportation plan and informed decision-making. I'd really like to thank the Volpe team for helping with these slides and the partners that helped test the tool. Again, if you're interested in learning more about the RDR tool itself, please reach out to Volpe. If you're interested in learning more about how to incorporate it in the LRTP, the TPO contact information is up here as well. And if time allows, I would love to hear your thoughts on this and how you might see this tool fitting into your planning efforts, or if you're curious about a specific access about this tool. So, thank you.
Thanks, Dale. That was awesome. Thank you so much for that. Are there any questions from anyone that I saw someone typed in? Can you send a link to the tool? I sent a link to the GitHub site there in the chat. And I think, Ellen, we maybe send these slides out at the end or post them somewhere. So the link will be in there too.
Yep, we will share the slides within a couple of weeks.
Cool. Yep. Put a link in there. So yeah, folks are asking for the link. So I think if there are no other questions for Dale and her team about the tool or how they use the tool, I think I'll quickly move to do the next poll question so we can get that, go back, get their launch. Okay, so the second question sort of is going to be focusing on the particular resilience efforts that you're focusing on recovery from immediate shocks, or are you focusing on longer term threats, or both? So the answers are coming in here. A lot of folks are saying both immediate and long term. The majority of folks are looking at both. So that's really good information actually to have. I'm just going to give it another 5 seconds for people to pop their responses in. Okay, I'm just going to share them quickly. So it looks like most folks are working both on immediate and long-term, about 50% of folks. And then the second most voted for answer is long-term threats. Not many folks are focused solely on immediate shocks. MPOs normally do end up looking more towards long-term planning with the long-range plan. So that does make sense to me, long-term threats and both immediate and long-term. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I do see that, okay, there was another question in the chat. So I think next we're going to go to Cassie Bott and Annie Dixon. We're going to first start with Cassie for a quick overview of the VAST tool. I always, say VAST tool because say tool twice. But and then we'll hear from Annie about how she's been using the tool at Indianapolis. Take it away, Cass.
Sounds great. Thank you, Catherine. Let me get my screen shared. And that should be working. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm sort of happy to be here in my capacity as a VAST power user, if you will. It's a tool that is created and available through Federal Highway Administration, and it's near and dear to my heart. So first I want to just sort of quick level setting on, so VAST is a tool that helps you do a natural hazard vulnerability assessment for a transportation system. So I wanted to have a couple slides on just very quick level setting of what is a natural hazard vulnerability assessment. And really it's a analysis on the degree to which the transportation system is affected by, potentially adversely affected by impacts of current and future extreme weather events. And there's honestly nothing stopping VAST from being used to consider any number of hazards, not just natural hazards, but it is primarily designed and intended around the use case around thinking about natural hazards and current and future extreme weather events. And vulnerability, VAST relies on the kind of standard definition of vulnerability as being a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So those are three key components of the tool and the process. I'll give you quick definitions now, but you'll hear me use those words a lot. So exposure being essentially, what is the location of the asset or the system with respect to the hazard? Does it experience the hazard? Sensitivity is essentially what happens when that asset experiences the hazard. So to what degree is the asset or system affected? You can think of like a depth damage function as one example. How much is a roadway potentially damaged when flooded? And then adaptive capacity is what is the capacity of the transportation system as a whole to cope with those impacts? So if something is exposed and sensitive, so it has some sort of impact, what are the broader consequences to the transportation system? And it's often, the way it's defined and used in VAST is often very similar to how often referred to as criticality in some assessments. And there are a number of ways to go about doing a vulnerability assessment and thinking through, what are these potential implications of current and future extreme weather events on a transportation system, ranging from kind of a purely qualitative stakeholder input kind of workshop-based approach. The two middle approaches here are more desktop-based, kind of data-driven analyses to think about vulnerability. And then on the right, we have what we call engineering-informed assessments that are typically focused on, individual assets, but really digging into, the design and site context of an individual asset to think about what are the right adaptation strategies and options for that asset. VAST helps implement this second approach here, an indicator-based assessment. So it's really based on this premise that there's information out there that can serve as indicators of each asset's exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And an indicator-based approach helps you kind of leverage that available data and information about those assets and kind of process it into, make sense of it in terms of an overall, eventually arrive at an overall vulnerability rating or score for that asset. It's good when you're looking across a wide number of systems, really trying to do some sort of screening analysis and figure out what are those top priorities. You can use it to derive either quantitative or qualitative ratings. It's good if it's most appropriate if you do have good data availability. And again, if you're trying to screen a large number of assets to make sense of what are those top priorities. And none of these approaches are mutually exclusive. They can all be used in combination. Stakeholder engagement, for example, and stakeholder input is a key component of even doing an indicator-based assessment. But yeah, essentially what VAST is, it's a tool to implement an indicator-based assessment. So again, yeah, so what is FHWA's vulnerability assessment scoring tool, or VAST? it is an Excel-based tool that walks the user through completing an indicator-based vulnerability assessment. So like I said before, this is an assessment that uses readily available quantitative data about, say, transportation assets, and walks you through a process of scoring and weighting the data to calculate an overall vulnerability score for each asset. Stakeholder engagement is a component of that process throughout to both provide input to some indicators like frequency of past flooding, and then also vetting and refining the results. It tends to be a very iterative process. The graphic at the right here shows an illustration of how those vulnerability scores are derived. Essentially, it's a series of weighted averages where you identify what are the indicators of each of these components, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, converting raw data on those indicators into a score. VAST uses a 1 to 4 rubric or rating scale, and overall, then again, combining those scores to come up with an overall vulnerability score. VAST provides a lot of starting points, but ultimately, the user can decide each step of the process. So for example, what indicators are you going to use? How do you want to assign scores to those indicator values? And what sort of weight do you want to assign to the different indicators and components? So again, the way it works, the user comes to the tool, the Excel spreadsheet, and makes those decisions and enters information at each step. And the tool provides step-by-step guidance throughout the process, as well as some example kind of defaults or starting points. And these overall steps are shown in the graphic at right, but from basic configuration of just setting up which types of stressors or hazards and what types of assets do you want to include, what are the specific assets you're going to evaluate, and then for each of the 3 components of vulnerability, choosing the indicators, inputting data about those indicators, and then refining the scoring methodology. And then at the end, it will output your vulnerability scores and results. So I'll highlight a few key features within that tool. So VAST includes what we refer to as an indicator library, basically example indicators for all these components you can use as a starting point. I will say the indicator libraries are a little bit dated at this point versus what's in the Excel spreadsheet, but there are lots of best practices and other indicators out there documented in, the dozens of assessments that have done indicator-based vulnerability assessments over the past 10 years. And I have some slides with those resources at the end of my presentation. The tool also, once you've kind of given it a list of the asset data and the indicators you like to use, it will create data collection templates for you to make it easy to populate that data from asset management databases or other databases you may have access to. And it includes several features for the user to adjust those scoring ranges and indicator weights. So I mentioned before, the user has full control over the methodology, and anywhere you see yellow cells in the tool is a place where the user can just go ahead and make some inputs. Again, the tool provides a lot of default formulas and starting points, but the user can really customize it to their liking. And at the end, it outputs a table with the full vulnerability scores and all of that broken down into its intermediate components for each asset. So it provides exposure scores, sensitivity scores, adaptive capacity scores, what we call damage scores, which are just a combination if you just wanted to isolate exposure and sensitivity together, and vulnerability scores. And there's a default results dashboard built into the tool that provides a high-level summary of the results, and it's also set up to easily export the results. So then you can, export it into your own database or dashboard, or, into a GIS format, so you can create maps of the results and things like that. Another snapshot of some of the features of the results dashboard. And I also wanted to note some, I call it implementation considerations. which is just VAST. While VAST is this Excel-based tool, it really is also a framework for doing a vulnerability assessment. And depending on the technical capabilities of your agency, you don't necessarily have to use the VAST spreadsheet tool to do what I would consider a VAST assessment, or to do an indicator-based assessment. There's multiple mechanisms you could use to do a VAST assessment, including just sort of building your own spreadsheet that can do these calculations, doing it purely in ArcGIS or some sort of some custom software, in addition to VAST itself. Indicator-based vulnerability assessments are by far the most common type of vulnerability assessment that have been done by transportation agencies, over the past decade since the tool has been released. This slide just highlights a handful of agencies that have used indicator-based vulnerability assessments, and some of which have used the actual Excel-based tool, and many of them have used some sort of DIY version of the same methodology. I also mentioned there are a lot of resources out there with some additional kind of guidance and best practices for selecting and scoring indicators, and basically doing that work of deciding what methodology you actually want to use. There's, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the FHWA resilience pilots. The kind of final reports from those projects are a great kind of wealth of knowledge and experience of lessons learned from doing these types of vulnerability assessments. FHWA also had a synthesis report across those pilots that I'll spotlight. There's a great table in one of those reports that has a list of every indicator that was used in all of these assessments. It's sort of a good updated version of the indicator library, if you will. And FHWA has also put together some workshops and peer exchanges in recent years on VAST best practices. So yeah, I wanted to call attention to that table in that FHWA pilot report that has all of the nitty-gritty details on updated indicators, if that's of interest. And finally, this slide just has a bunch of links. So the VAST tool itself, there's also a really detailed user guide that accompanies the tool, as well as some training webinars, materials from that FHWA VAST peer exchange back in March 2019. And that link at the bottom, I have the link to that 2015 pilot summary report with the table of indicators used. So I'd love to take any questions. I think we're going to hand it over to Annie to share her experience working with VAST, and then we'll take questions as a collective on VAST overall.
Thanks, Kat. I think we're going to switch over to Annie now. So Annie, you can pull up your slides whenever you get a chance.
Hello, can you all see my screen?
I can see them. I can see your slides.
All right, perfect. Just wanted to introduce this title slide and make a note in the context of resiliency and what we're talking about today. We developed a regional resiliency snapshot, which used the VAST tool that Cassie just described as part of developing a Protect Program Resilience Improvement Plan. Acknowledge we're not sure where that program will go in kind of the direction at the federal level, but wanted to give some context that there are some components in here that address those resilience improvement plan requirements, as well as we tried to make it useful beyond the life of the Protect program. Quick intro here on just kind of what is resiliency. We define it as the ability to adapt to changing conditions and prepare for, withstand, and recover from those disruptions. These disruptions can be events or conditions that interfere with predicted cycles, and we classified these as kind of those shocks and stressors. So we had a poll question earlier related to, are you focused on more of those near-term shocks or immediate impacts, or some of those longer-term threats, essentially, that take place over the course of years, and we classified those in this document as stressors. We tried to account for both and kind of looking at those short-term and long-term impacts. Want to just highlight here quickly what our scope was in the context of developing a resilience improvement plan, but also generally and holistically evaluating the resiliency of the central Indiana region. So we contracted with Cambridge Systematics to develop this document, and so we wanted it to include kind of a holistic snapshot of where the region stood in terms of regional resources and threats to those resources. And then the key component that we're going to hone in on today is that task 5 on the right there, which was the risk-based assessment of transportation infrastructure. That was the component that used the VAST tool. But just wanted to note that we conducted stakeholder engagement and engaged with the public. We took a look at resources in the region, threats to those resources, specifically honed in on transportation, and then looked at the vulnerability of the region and then provided some recommendations as well. So we started with a general identification of resources. You can see we broke those into a few different categories. So we broke those into 3 categories: natural capital, which included things like bodies of water and parks and green spaces; financial capital, which is obviously our largest one, and that included the transportation piece. But we took a look at kind of key emergency shelters and things like that; and then social capital there at the bottom, which included employment, population, social vulnerability, and more. So after we have identified kind of these key resources that exist here in the crossroads of America, we also took a look at different threats. This is a key component to the VAST piece because you have to identify which threats you're going to build into that tool. Originally, we started by taking a look at the multi-hazard mitigation plans that exist within our region. These usually take place at the county level, but we also took a look at the state's plan as well. We figured there were other emergency management departments and other organizations that have been working on resiliency, and just because this was one of our first steps doesn't mean that there wasn't already kind of a precedent set and work that had been completed. So we took a look at these threats across the board for these multi-hazard mitigation plans, and we tried to pull out the ones that seem to be appearing over and over again in each of our counties, or if they were ranked as kind of highest probability and highest impact. So for our entire snapshot, we evaluated all of the threats on the screen here, and you can see they vary from things that are really, really physical, like a dam failure or hazardous material incident, to other things that are a little bit less so, like policies and misinformation, and other things like population flux as well. The yellow stars here on the slide are the threats that we brought into that risk-based assessment of transportation infrastructure. And so that's what we pulled into the VAST tool specifically for transportation. So part of our kind of next step was mapping each of these threats to existing resources. So this was kind of part of this holistic snapshot, but it also carried over into VAST. We have 2 different graphs here. The one on the left shows a map of the central Indiana region. It shows the tornado risk index rating based on very high, relatively high, moderate, relatively low, and low. This was by census tract, and if you look closely as well, you can see both the local emergency shelters as well as kind of national shelter facilities. So we tried to map out, where are the most vulnerable regions, but where are the assets that are going to be most threatened by those kind of very high risk areas. On the right, you can see we've mapped transportation resources by functional classification and then the winter weather risk rating. So you can see kind of the darker shade indicates a higher risk for severe winter weather, and then where those roadway assets are falling in terms of that threat. Wanted to jump in specifically to how we used VAST in this assessment. Something that we did as part of our resiliency analysis that I think is a little different from other organizations was we actually conducted this full transportation analysis using VAST on every single asset on functional classes 3 through 6 in the region. Some other agencies that have worked on this kind of similar project used VAST for specifically defined projects. So say LPAs were submitting projects that they were interested in, and those were being put in with those defined areas into the VAST network. We actually did this for multiple functional classes. And I want to call attention to one thing here and call back to what Cassie was presenting earlier. One thing that we ran into as part of this was deciding what really was an asset. If we were looking at full functional classes in a 9-county area, an asset could be divided equally among like a mile grid. You could say all of these assets are considered individual asset IDs for the purposes of analyzing them. But when you get into really dense urban areas, you could be pulling in many more individual roads than, say, out in a rural area. So we actually had to go through a process of segmenting like continuous county roads at certain points and saying this is one asset to put into the vulnerability tool. So that was something unique to doing this at the entire kind of network level. We utilized a 2-part scoring. One was risk using the VAST tool by FHWA, but we also scored these assets for how critical they were to the general region. So we'll get into that in a few minutes here. This graph shows how we scored each asset. So every asset was scored high, medium, or low for risk, which is on the vertical axis there. And then every asset was also scored for how critical it was. Same high, medium, low, and that's on the horizontal axis. So what this produced was essentially kind of XY coordinates for each of these 2 categories to say this bridge or this road is high risk, high criticality, moderate, low, etc. Cassie covered this a little bit, but wanted to just kind of remind you as we look into the risk calculations, all of the different kind of pieces that went into that scoring. So the calculation for risk includes looking at vulnerability, consequences, and then probability of that occurring. And then the vulnerability piece is where we brought in that VAST tool. So that's where we're looking at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. You can see below those grids how that equation kind of worked out to assign values for the overall risk score. So just wanted to pull out here, we've been talking about how we scored each asset for risk and criticality. We assigned 1 risk score following using the VAST tool for 4 key threats. So these were extreme heat in the region, flooding, tornado, and winter storm or severe winter snow and weather. So all of those were put through the VAST process, and that was assigned 1 risk score for each asset. We weighted those risks equally. So in the VAST tool, you can decide how much weight to apply. We applied them all equally to get 1 score. Criticality is where we pulled in how critical is this asset to the region in terms of the individuals that are using it and other kind of modal aspects. So we had 3 categories to score for criticality, and you can see the weights assigned as well. First category was mobility and use. This was weighted at 30%. It included what's the functional classification, total AADT, truck AADT, and the number of transit routes that are using that asset. Second category was connectivity. So this is essentially looking at, did this asset provide access to a hospital? Did it provide access to a grocery store? Or did it connect to other transportation infrastructure, such as kind of multimodal paths, sidewalks, bikeways, etc.? Final category here was equity and people. This was weighted at 40%. So this is looking at what's the population density around the asset, what's the employment density around the asset, and then is that asset serving a transportation disadvantage tract? For that, we pulled in both our environmental justice areas that we use at the MPO level, and we also used the historically disadvantaged tracts as well. I want to take a moment on this slide. Let me grab a laser pointer here. This is basically a summary of everything I've described so far for how we've scored assets. So here we have that same 9-box grid where we have risk that we used the VAST tool. here on the left with low, medium, high. We also have criticality here on the horizontal axis with low, medium, and high. So down here for criticality, these are the three kind of buckets per se that I just described that are contributing to that overall criticality score. On the left here, this is showing how that exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity kind of were played out using VAST for each of the individual threats. And then all four of those threats kind of culminated into one risk score. So just want to walk you through one example. For the extreme heat threat that we examined, we looked at both 2030 and 2050 horizons because we're focused on the long range impacts, of course. So we looked at a local resource that was specific to the state of Indiana that analyzed projected annual number of hot days and uncomfortable nights to describe like where is the greatest vulnerability to the most extreme heat in 2030 and 2050. So those two scenarios were essentially that exposure piece in terms of how exposed were these assets. For sensitivity, we used pavement condition and bridge condition. So this was from things like PACER ratings and PCI ratings to say how sensitive is this asset and what's the condition in it. For the adaptive capacity piece, we used network density. So this is essentially an analysis of network links that exist around the asset to decide, okay, if this asset were to buckle under extreme heat, how far out of their way would trucks or passengers have to travel with that asset being removed as an option? So that's how those three kind of core pieces of risk played out for each of the threats that we identified, and then all of those were weighted equally to assign one risk score for each asset in this kind of 9-box grid. We also have a story map that describes each of these threats and also allows you to slide between the greatest risks for 2030 as well as 2050. If you're really interested in data, try to pull out where we pulled this information from in each for each threat, as well as for the criticality pieces. So you can see them classified by vulnerability, criticality, and then the type. Sources are over here on the right. I just wanted to note, in every case that we could, we used as specific local data as we could find. So as I mentioned earlier, for things like extreme heat, we used a resource developed by a local university for the entire state. In areas where we did not have that kind of hyper-specific data, we leaned pretty heavily on the FEMA National Risk Index. It's a really great tool that's GIS-based that you can download the maps and the Excel sheets, but they identify, I think it's over 20 different threats, everything from tornado to tsunami, and assign specific values for risk at the census tract level. So where there were places that we couldn't find data in specific areas, we were leaning a little bit on that national risk index, and that's linked here on this slide as well. You can see we pulled in other things like our environmental justice areas. We used some OpenStreetMap for a few things, as well as Streetlight. You kind of take a dive into this data. I wanted to show you kind of the core results that came out of this. So over here on the right, you can see that 9-box grid with risk and criticality. When we were trying to pass this document, I think I was saying 9-box grid in my sleep, but that's kind of the key to this total overall ranking. You can see the region here, the darker the shade indicates those high risk, high critical corridors. You can see it kind of overlaps with some urban areas, and that's part of that criticality piece that's being factored in. There's a little bit less prioritization out here in slightly more rural areas. Here are the same results for bridges as well. And so these, we took a look at where these bridges were located on which assets and how those assets scored, and then assigned those scores to the relative bridges as well. Wanted to make a note here, upon adoption of our regional resiliency snapshot, our policy board also voted to make the resiliency score part of the MTP or the LRTP planning process and pull it into the scoring as well. So following the conclusion of this initial analysis, we had to score MTP projects as well. So for those projects that were on existing assets, so those that were maybe a capacity expansion or adding a lane, we went ahead and pulled in those risk and criticality scores for those assets to contribute to the MTP scoring. But as you know, in the MTP, sometimes projects that are proposed are entirely new roads that did not get originally analyzed in the VAST assessment. So we went ahead and scored those new roads that weren't originally included in the analysis. And those prioritized list of projects were pulled in to the MTP with the snapshot incorporated by reference. Here's how we assigned those scores. For the MTP, the resiliency score was pulled in as 5 points of 100 possible in the long range plan. So basically any asset that was scored in these top right 3 boxes received a score of 5. Any in these middle 3 boxes here received a score of 3, and any of them in these kind of bottom left 3 boxes received a score of 1. Quick note on public engagement, we pulled in a stakeholder group to talk about risks and threats. We hosted some technical webinars to really take a deep dive into VAST and answer any questions by the board. And we also had some public engagement as well. I'm gonna go ahead and skip over tips and tricks because I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, but happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks for being so specific, and I think it's stuff like this that is really useful for folks who are embarking on these types of projects of their own. And I don't see any questions in the chat. You guys know where to find us. I'm just gonna put up this last poll question for everyone who's still here. What tools do you guys use for resilience-related planning?
And while we're responding, I'll acknowledge some folks probably have to leave. It's the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks to Catherine for pulling this together, and to Dale, Cassie, and Annie for speaking. You can stick around to respond to the poll or ask a question if you want to.
Looks like a second person used RDR. I have 2 positive responses for RDR. I know one of them is probably Dale. A lot of folks are saying that they aren't using any tools. So maybe this could jumpstart your use of some new tools. I'm just going to share the results really quick. A couple of people used VAST, a couple used RDR. Some folks are using custom tools. But yeah, just thank you everyone for joining and for listening to our amazing speakers who are doing really awesome work. And just again, thank you to everyone who joined, especially thanks to the folks who joined last minute. Thank you, Annie.
Yes, and thank you again to Catherine for pulling this together. Thank you for joining us. It's really great to see all of you. I dropped a bunch of links in the chat, different forums that AMPO has where you could discuss this work. And yeah, we will share the notes and the slides within a couple weeks. So thank you again. Have a great day.